without any further ado, what is Copilot? Microsoft is really good at naming things. I'm sure we've all noticed across over the years, and Copilot and AI is no different. And so when a lot of people think about Copilot, they are thinking about a specific product. That could be Copilot for 365, that could be Copilot for Sales, that could be Copilot Studio. But at the forefront or at the core of Copilot, Copilot is really just a brand name. It is Microsoft's brand name that represents their suite of large language model AI based products. And so I always find it's helpful to understand that Copilot itself is a name, it's a brand name, and it represents the suite of products that allow users to interact with data via human language. That's all it is at its core. And so here on this diagram, we've got Copilot logo in the center. And then the next wheel out is the area of Microsoft that Copilot is going to integrate with. And then at the very edge of this wheel, we see all the individual products that Copilot has an integration with. And so when we're thinking about Copilot, we're really just thinking about a new way for users to interact with data. And the data source is going to ultimately determine the Copilot product. So the ones that we're going to be talking about most today are going to be Copilot for 365 and Copilot for Web. Those two go hand in hand together. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that there are Copilots that you can get within Dynamics. There's Copilot for Service, Copilot for Sales that allow you to integrate with Dynamics environments. There's Security Copilot, which is much more of an administrative tool set that allows you to harness the power of generative AI to ask questions about your security environment, give some feedback and some thoughts, as well as to analyze telemetry data. And then lastly, there's Copilot Studio, which is, think about it as create your own instance of a Copilot chatbot where you get to determine the data set. And so before we move on, I did just want to make sure we review Copilot, large language model, AI-based products. The data set that we're interacting with determines the product. And so moving on, we've got Copilot for 365. When anybody is thinking about Copilot, this is probably the product we're thinking about, where we can, as users, interact with the data in the Microsoft environment across SharePoint, across OneDrive, across Teams, across Exchange, and within the individual applications to analyze, aggregate, and transform data. While alternatively, we have Copilot for the web, which is included in all Microsoft 365 bundled licensing. If you've got an M365 license that gives you email and applications for one fixed cost, you've got Copilot for the web. This represents Microsoft's large language model AI product that leverages the known internet as the data set. And so one key distinction I want to try to make right here is when we are asking questions or looking for insights about information that we have in our environment, we're going to use Copilot for 365. When we're asking questions that can't be found, the answers are not in Teams, they're not in SharePoint, they're not in your inbox, they're not anywhere in your environment, we're going to go to Copilot for the web. And so that is Copilot in a nutshell, a suite of large language model generative AI products that allow users to interact with data via human language, and the data set that the user is interacting with determines the product that the user will be using within the Copilot product sphere. Any questions before we move on? I do have the chat open up and not seeing anything, so we will move right along. So how does this all work? To explain how Copilot for 365 works, I like this diagram here. I stole it from Microsoft because this is the only diagram and thing that I've found online that really helps understand how Copilot for 365 works to the non-technical level. And so before we dive in and explain all of this diagram, it is good to set some additional context, which is how did we get here? The way that we got here, i.e. me being on a webinar talking to you about Microsoft Copilot, really started way back in 2019 when OpenAI piqued the interest of Microsoft's CEO Satya. And Microsoft had been really lying in wait for the better part of a decade, watching the market, looking for emerging technologies, trying to figure out what's going to be the next big thing, what's going to be our next big bet. And so turns out in 2015, OpenAI was founded as a nonprofit organization to try to solve the challenge of what is the new iteration of AI. And so OpenAI throughout 2019, 2020, 2021 did a ton of research and development. And what they came out with was ChatGPT. I'm sure at this point, everybody on the call has at least heard of or maybe even played around with ChatGPT. That is OpenAI's large language model product. Microsoft, back in 2019, saw what OpenAI was doing, and Satya said, this is the next thing. This is where we're going to place the biggest bet as a company we've ever placed on a technology. And they pledged $40 billion to OpenAI and acquired 49% of their for-profit side of the business. Told you, really big bet. And so what Microsoft got for that 40 billion investment is the ability to license OpenAI's ChatGPT source code and repurpose it to make their own instance of the product that's going to be specific for the commercial instance. And so I like starting and providing that context because when we think about how Copilot works, it's fundamental that we first understand that the large language model, which is OpenAI's ChatGPT, that Microsoft has taken the code and thrown it in their own private data centers. We call Microsoft's private cloud Azure, and hence we have Azure OpenAI. So the large language model, which right now is ChatGPT 4 Turbo, is currently sitting in a Microsoft data center, doing its thing, computing all day, all night. Independent of if we have a license, independent of if we're using it, that's just here sitting out in the cloud. And so when we buy the $360 per user per year license and we assign it to a user, all we're doing is we're giving ourselves access to the large language model in the cloud by bringing a Copilot agent into the tenancy. So at no point are we taking a massive large language model and moving it into your environment. That would just be feasibly impossible. And that's some of the concern that I feel that I hear a lot of times with business owners and customers saying, I'm interested in taking advantage of Copilot, but I'm concerned about just releasing an AI in my environment without any checks and balances. And so first and foremost, you wouldn't even be doing that. And so when we buy the $360 license, we're getting this Copilot agent that can communicate with the large language model. And before we can do anything functional with it, the first thing Copilot has to do, or the agent has to do, is catalog and index all of the data in your Microsoft environment that that user has access to. And we do that via the Microsoft Graph, and it's called leveraging the semantic index. This is taking all of the static data, whether it's emails, whether it's Teams meetings, Teams transcripts, documents in SharePoint, documents in OneDrive, and all the ancillary data that might be floating around your environment. It takes it in the graph and turns it into a functional, relatable, searchable database. And when a user opens up one of their applications, whether it's the Edge browser to use the most global instance of Copilot, the Word browser, or the Word app, Teams, PowerPoint, Outlook, Excel, and they provide a prompt, they'll do so in just human language, not in code. So just asking for a thing in human language. Copilot will then take that human language prompt and it will pre-process it via a process called grounding. The way that I think about this is it takes your human language and it converts it to the code that is readable by the large language model. It then finds all the necessary pieces of data in your environment that are requisite for responding to the user prompt, and then takes an alphanumeric representation of your data, not the data itself, an alphanumeric representation of the data. That is encrypted and goes out to the large language model, where the large language model does its processing, generates a response, it's post-processed, and then delivered back to the human in human language. This entire process happens in real time, and everything on this side right here, you'll notice this is called the Microsoft Trust Boundary. This represents the division between the data in your tenant and the interaction with the large language model. Everything from this side over, once Microsoft returns your response, it wipes and deletes the memory. So there is no running list of prompts on the back end that Microsoft can look at and search and do anything with. There is no opportunity for Microsoft to leverage your search data, your queries, to train the model globally. And your data, again, never leaves the Microsoft environment. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about that, just because so many concerns that have come up to me over the months of talking about Copilot and presenting to partners and their customers has been centered around who has my data, what is my data being used for, is Microsoft doing anything with my data, and are they profiting off of my data in any way other than allowing me to access it and use it with this license? And the answer to all of those questions are, who has your data? You do, as the user and the administrators. Microsoft technically houses your data, but they do that already today. And the addition of Copilot doesn't give them any additional access. So that's important to know. So fundamentally, who has your data? You do. What is my data being used for? Whatever it is that you are leveraging Copilot to use it for, to respond to a prompt. Microsoft is not doing anything with your data once it is returned to you, i.e. because they physically can't. They built that process, they built that into the workflow, into the process to mitigate anybody from being able to intercept your information, log it, and do anything with it. And so just by the way that Microsoft has architected all of this, they have intentionally done so to mitigate a lot of the security and compliance risks, at least from the Microsoft side. Now, because this works this way, Copilot is going to act as an extension of the user. And so anything they ask for here, if they have access to it via group membership, or it's been shared with them, or it's just accessible to the entire company, Copilot doesn't know that they shouldn't have access to it because they inherently do. And so anything that a user has access to that they ask for, Copilot has the capability to bring that back to them. And so while that's an incredibly powerful tool that we can harness to be, if nothing else, the most efficient and strongest e-discovery solution that the world has ever seen, but more importantly, it allows us to find information, aggregate information, analyze information, and then either use that analyzed information to inform a decision or generate new content. And while that's incredibly powerful, it does open up some potential risk. And so did want to take a quick second to just touch on what are the prerequisites for leveraging Copilot. When I first made this slide deck, there were a lot less options on this list. Honestly, Microsoft has taken the decision to cast a wide net with who as a user base is eligible for Copilot based on their Microsoft licensing. And so any license that we see here, from a business basic to an M365 E5 license, is technically eligible to leverage Copilot. However, when we dig into the risks here in a bit, we might feel a little different towards the end about what licensing we're going to feel comfortable providing our users that are also going to have Copilot. But that's the licensing side. And then on the alternative side of the requirements is there's got to be a data conversation. Copilot and generative AI in general is only going to be as valuable of a tool as the data it has access to. And so as we're evaluating Copilot and generative AI, we need to understand where is the important data that we're hoping to leverage for Copilot. Because Copilot can only access data that's in the Microsoft environment, i.e. in your tenant, or data that has been actively integrated into your Microsoft environment via a Power Platform premium connector. So is the data accessible to Copilot? Is primary question. Secondary question there is how much of that data is reliable? A recent poll beginning of this year showed that roughly 75% of companies didn't trust their own data. We want to have a good understanding of how much of the data in our environment that's important to us is clean and good data versus stale and out of date, because we want to have as strong of a signal and reduce the noise as humanly possible. And then lastly is if Copilot can access the data and we're certain that that data is clean, do the right users have access to that data? Because again, Copilot is only going to have access to the data that a user implicitly does. And the way that I think about that is if a user can navigate the GUI to go access a thing, Copilot will pull that back for them instantaneously. And so that opens up the question of, do we have appropriate data sharing and appropriate data access in our environment? And so those are the requirements. We just need a bundled M365 license, as well as some data that we're hoping to leverage for Copilot. Ideally, the data is in the Microsoft environment and or actively connected via connector. That data is clean and the correct users have access to that data. Any questions before we move on? All right, so moving into the risks. Might already start to have some come to mind since we now know that Copilot is a tool that allows users to interact with data via human language, and that Copilot for Work will allow a user to access and interact with data that they implicitly have access to. That in and of itself is going to open up some risk. Now, luckily, this is not going to introduce any net new or brand new risk that we've never had to deal with. We've no idea what to do with. What it actually does is it just shines a magnifying glass on some existing risks that are already important and we need to try to mitigate. First and foremost, external threats, right? People that are outside of your organization that are trying to get in to either deploy a payload or steal information. Well, if we now understand how Copilot works and that it allows a user to access and pull any information in the environment that they do have access to, we now have to run the thought experiment of what happens if a user has access to sensitive information and they are breached. It's not going to be a good day. So there are going to be identity and security, this identity security, email security, endpoint security, mitigation tactics that we're going to want to put in place to ensure that when a user does have Copilot and is logging in and accessing any data in the system, especially sensitive data, that we are darn near certain that that user is who they say they are and they have the appropriate level of access such that they can be productive without taking on any additional risk. Which then brings us to the next side of that, which is insider threats. People internal to the organization accidentally seeing something that they shouldn't have access to, or maliciously searching and trying to find information and then do something nefarious with it. The second, we're going to chalk that up to like good hiring, firing practices and company culture. Can't help that much with that. But as far as the accidental exposure, that's something that matters and that's something that we can mitigate against. And so we're going to get into some of the ways that we can start thinking about solving and mitigating these risks. But those are the two that are going to be top of mind. How do we make sure that users that have Copilot are the only users that are able to get into the environment, i.e., they're not being breached. And secondarily, users that have Copilot only have the appropriate level of access, not too much to do any data risks or data exposures, and not too little that they're not productive.